I'm Sheena Larson, and this is my volunteer today, Stanley, and his owner, Jessica. So we're going to be going over some different muscles, and I'm going to be starting off with the extrinsic muscles of the thoracic limb. So I'm going to start off with the superficial pectoral muscle, which is located between the front legs in the chest area, in about this area here. The action of the superficial pectoral is to adduct the thoracic limb, so it pulls the limb in towards the midline. The deep pectoral muscle is covered cranially by the superficial pectoral, but it is larger and wider than the superficial pectoral. The deep pectoral extends farther caudally. It also adducts the front limb and pulls the limb caudally. And then moving on to the brachiocephalicus, it's a group of muscles that are Y-shaped. They're separated into two regions, so they extend from the base of the skull and they kind of go down here and then attach onto the cranial aspect of the humerus. The two regions are the cleidobrachialis and the cleidocephalicus. So they're separated in the clavicle, which is roughly, here's the scapula, so it's roughly from here onto the front limb is the cleidobrachialis, and the cleidocephalicus goes from here up to the base of the skull. The action of the brachiocephalicus muscles are to pull the limb forward, extend the shoulder, so like that, and it lowers and pulls the head and neck laterally. So the head goes down and the head moves laterally. What a good boy, Stan. I'm sorry, bud. And then moving on to the trapezius muscle, which also connects to the base of the skull here. And it's a thin triangular muscle that lies over the dorsal part of the scapula. So it lies over like that. The action of the trapezius is to elevate and abduct the limb. So it moves the scapula up and it abducts the limb, which is away from the midline. The rhomboideus is beneath, deep to the trapezius. It's in the same kind of area. It connects to the base of the skull, and then it goes down to the scapula here, kind of in this area. It also elevates the forelimb, so moves it up. You are stronger than I am though, bud. And then moving on to the latissimus dorsi. The latissimus dorsi is a large triangular shaped muscle that lies caudal to the scapula, and it covers a large portion of the dorsal thorax. So the scapula is here, so it lies from about here, goes caudally. The action of the latissimus dorsi is to draw the limb caudally, so flex the shoulder and it flexes the shoulder. Moving on to the serratus ventralis. The serratus ventralis is a large muscle in the shoulder which has a serrated appearance on the ventral aspect of the thoracic portion. So this here, it kind of looks like a saw. And then it has a more cranial portion as well. it supports the trunk and it depresses the scapula, so it moves everything down. The muscles of the head and neck. So the sternocephalicus, it connects kind of on the lateral side here of the base of the skull, and it comes down and it attaches to the sternum. So it goes along here, and it, along with the brachiocephalicus, forms the jugular groove, which goes along here. The action of the sternocephalicus is to draw the head to the side, so it turns the head. The muscles of mastication. You're okay, bud. So first of all, I'm going to point out the parotid and mandibular salivary glands. So the parotid is located somewhere in about here. And then the mandibular salivary gland is ventral to that, so probably mandibular, probably more around here. I really can't feel anything on you, bud. I'm sorry. So the parotid is more dorsal than the mandibular salivary gland. And then the submaxillary lymph node is in, so there's his lower jaw, and it's in about here, right about here. What a good boy, Stan. And then for the actual muscles, I'm going to start off with the temporalis. The temporalis is the largest muscle on the head, and it is found on the lateral and dorsal sides of the skull. So in about on this side here. The action of the temporalis muscle is to elevate the mandible to close the jaw. So like that, and close. And it also moves the mandible laterally, which he's not going to let me do, but that's fine. I know, I touched you. Moving on to the masseter muscle. The masseter muscle is ventral to the zygomatic arch. So the zygomatic arch is right here. So the masseter muscle is here. It also elevates the mandible to close the mouth when chewing. So if his mouth is open, the masseter muscle helps to close it. Onto the digastricus. The digastricus muscle is a thin strap-like muscle along the ventral caudal edge of the mandible. So right about here, and it opens the mouth. So opens. And then the mylohyoideus. The mylohyoideus forms a sling for the tongue right about here, and it raises the floor of the mouth. Intrinsic muscles of the thoracic limb. So I'm going to start off by pointing out the location of the prescapular lymph node, which is located, here's the scapula, so it's in between the scapula and the thoracic wall, so it's kind of about in this area. And then I'm going to go on to the muscles. So the deltoideus muscle is a lateral muscle of the shoulder. So it's in about this area, and it flexes the shoulder, so it pulls the limb back. And then the infraspinatus muscle is caudal to the spine of the scapula. So the scapula is here, so the spine of the scapula is here, so it's caudal to the spine. It also flexes the shoulder, and it abducts the limb, so it pulls it away from the body. The supraspinatus muscle is cranial to the spine of the scapula. So spine of the scapula is here, it's about here, and it extends the shoulder. The subscapularis is located on the medial aspect of the scapula, so it's more inside. I know you're not really going to let me show it. It's on the medial aspect of the scapula. It adducts the limb and rotates the forearm medially. So it takes it towards the midline and rotates the limb in. The teres major is caudal to the subscapularis muscle. So it's about here, and it flexes the shoulder. It pulls it back. The biceps brachii is on the craniomedial aspect of the humerus. So it's along here, and it flexes the elbow and extends the shoulder. The brachialis muscle is on the lateral side of the humerus, and it flexes the elbow. So flexes the elbow. The triceps brachii muscle is the large muscle on the caudal aspect of the humerus, and it extends the elbow, so it goes from there and straightens out the elbow, and flexes the shoulder. So that extends, leg goes back. And then onto the digital flexors and extensors. They are located, the digital extensors are located on the front of the leg, the cranial and dorsal part of the limb, and they extend all of these joints. So they extend everything. The digital flexors are on the back of the leg, so caudal and palmar, and they flex all of these joints. Pelvic limb, I'm going to start by showing the location of the popliteal lymph node, which is medial to the biceps femoris and caudal to the stifle joint. It's right here, and it feels like a large P. The tensor fasciae latae is a triangular shaped muscle, which extends the hip and extends the stifle. The gluteal muscles are a group of 3 muscles located here. There's the superficial, middle, and deep. The superficial gluteal muscle is a small triangular muscle that overlies the caudal part of the middle gluteal muscle. The middle gluteal muscle is a large egg-shaped muscle that lies cranial to the superficial gluteal. And the deep gluteal muscle is completely covered by the middle gluteal. It lies deep. The gluteals abduct and extend the hip, so move it away from the midline and extend. The biceps femoris is the longest and widest muscle of the thigh. It extends the hip, flexes the stifle, and extends the tarsus. The semitendinosus muscle is medial to the biceps femoris. It extends the hip, flexes the stifle, and extends the tarsus. The semimembranosus, it doesn't connect as distally as the semitendinosus, so it doesn't go as far down. Both are good sites for intramuscular injections, and they extend the hip. The sartorius muscle is made up of 2 strap-like muscles, or 2 strap-like parts that lie on the cranial and cranial medial aspects of the thigh. They flex the hip and extend the stifle. The gracilis muscle is a large, wide, flat muscle which covers the caudal medial aspect of the medial thigh. It adducts the limb, flexes the stifle, and extends the hip and hock. The pectineus muscle is a small spindle-shaped muscle located on the medial aspect, and it adducts the limb towards the body. The quadriceps femoris is on the cranial aspect of the thigh. It consists of 4 heads, which fuse together to form a common tendon, the patellar tendon, and it is the most powerful extensor of the stifle. So it extends the stifle and flexes the hip. The gastrocnemius muscle is the most superficial of the caudal leg muscles, and it is often called the calf muscle. It extends the tarsus and flexes the stifle. So flexes the stifle and extends the tarsus. The digital flexors are located along the caudal plantar aspect, and they flex these joints. Oh, I'm sorry, bud. I know you don't want me touching your feet. The digital extensors are located along the cranial dorsal aspect, and they extend all of these joints. The muscles of the abdomen. There are 4 sets of muscles which support the abdomen, and they function in abdominal press, which is the compression of the abdominal viscera, and it's used in functions like urination and defecation. The external abdominal oblique muscle runs caudal ventral, and the internal abdominal oblique runs cranial ventral, and both of those function in flexing the vertebral column and abdominal press, so they flex the vertebral column. And then the transversus abdominis is the deepest abdominal muscle. It basically forms a sling to hold the abdominal contents, and it flexes the vertebral column and functions in abdominal press. Then finally, there's the rectus abdominis, which are strips that run from the sternum to the pelvis, and they function in abdominal press. The muscles of respiration and the vertebral column. So the serratus dorsalis cranialis and the serratus dorsalis caudalis are located along the dorsal thorax, and have a serrated edge similar to the serratus ventralis. The serratus dorsalis cranialis is located more caudally, or more cranially, sorry, and they lift the ribs for inspiration. And the serratus dorsalis caudalis are located more caudally. They draw the last 3 or 4 ribs caudally for expiration. The external intercostals are muscles between the ribs, and they function in inspiration. They draw the ribs together so as to enlarge the thoracic cavity, and the internal intercostals are deeper than the external intercostals. They function in expiration. They draw the ribs together so as to narrow the thoracic cavity. The diaphragm is the partition between the thoracic and abdominal cavities and function in inspiration. The epaxial muscles are the only muscles that are dorsal to the vertebral column and ribs. The 3 epaxial muscle systems are the iliocostalis, longissimus, and transversospinalis, and they function in extending the vertebral column. So actually like that. He extends the vertebral column.